Cowboy confronts an 85-year-old Apache. 30 minutes later, the son arrives with his own clan. But what started as a simple trespassing dispute was about to become something no one could have predicted. Garrett McKinley spotted the old man from 100 yards away, sitting motionless by the creek that cut through his property. The Apache's weathered hands rested on a walking stick, his gray hair catching the midday sun like silver threads. He looked fragile, almost ghostly against the backdrop of twisted cottonwoods. Garrett's jaw tightened as he spurred his horse forward. This was his land, bought and paid for with sweat and blood. He'd worked 16-hour days to build this ranch from nothing, and he wasn't about to let some wandering Indian think he could just set up camp wherever he pleased. The closer he rode, the angrier he became. The old man hadn't even acknowledged his approach, just sat there like he owned the place, like generations of McKinleys hadn't fought and died to carve civilization out of this wilderness. Garrett dismounted 20 feet away, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate force. The Apache finally looked up, revealing eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. But Garrett saw only defiance. "You're trespassing, old man," Garrett said, his voice cutting through the afternoon stillness. "This is private property." The Apache's expression didn't change. He simply nodded toward the creek where clear water bubbled over smooth stones. "Water calls to all living things," Joseph Red Hawk said quietly, his English careful but clear. "I meant no harm." "I don't care what you meant," Garrett snapped. "You can't just wander onto people's land because you're thirsty. There's a town 5 miles east with a well." He thought about the stories he'd heard growing up. Raiding parties, stolen livestock, families murdered in their beds. This old man might look harmless, but Garrett knew better than to trust appearances. Indians were Indians, and they'd cause nothing but trouble for decent folks trying to make an honest living. "I'll walk," Joseph said, struggling to push himself up with his walking stick. His legs trembled with the effort, and for a moment, it looked like he might collapse back onto the ground. Garrett watched the old man struggle with growing impatience. Part of him knew he should probably help, but pride and prejudice held him back. This was exactly the kind of situation that led to problems. Show one Indian kindness, and soon you'd have the whole tribe thinking they had a right to your land. "Make it quick," Garrett said, crossing his arms, "and don't come back." But as Joseph Red Hawk took his first shaky step away from the creek, something happened that changed everything. The old man's walking stick caught on a root, and he stumbled forward, crying out in pain as his body hit the hard ground. Garrett stared down at the fallen Apache, wrestling with conflicting emotions. The practical part of his mind told him to just watch the old man leave. But something deeper, something his mother had tried to teach him about basic human decency, made him hesitate. That hesitation would cost him everything. Because 30 miles away, Thomas Red Hawk had already noticed his father's absence. And when Thomas Red Hawk went looking for his missing father, he never rode alone. Garrett stood frozen as Joseph Red Hawk lay motionless on the ground, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where he'd struck a stone. The old man's breathing was shallow, his eyes closed, and for a terrifying moment Garrett thought he might be dead. His mind raced through the implications. A dead Apache on his property would bring nothing but trouble. The territorial authorities would ask questions he couldn't answer cleanly. Worse, if this old man had family looking for him, they'd eventually trace his path here. "Hey!" Garrett called out, his voice rougher than intended. "Old man, you all right?" Joseph's eyes fluttered open, but he seemed dazed, confused. He tried to sit up and winced, clutching his ribs where he'd landed on the rocky ground. Garrett found himself stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to stay back. The smart thing would be to get this Apache off his land as quickly as possible, before anyone came looking. But the old man clearly couldn't walk, maybe couldn't even stand. "Can you get up?" Garrett asked, hating that he was showing concern. Joseph struggled to push himself into a sitting position, his face contorting with pain. When he spoke, his voice was weaker than before. "My ribs," he whispered. "Something broken." Garrett cursed under his breath. This was exactly the kind of situation that turned a simple property dispute into a nightmare. He couldn't leave an injured old man here to die, but he also couldn't risk the complications that helping him would bring. He glanced toward the horizon, scanning for any signs of other riders. The last thing he needed was to be found standing over an injured Apache with no witnesses to explain what really happened. "Look," Garrett said, kneeling down reluctantly. "I didn't push you. You fell on your own." Joseph Red Hawk studied Garrett's face with those ancient eyes, and something passed between them. not understanding exactly, but recognition of their mutual predicament. "I know," Joseph said simply. "You help me to shade?" Every fiber of Garrett's being screamed against it. His father had always warned him about showing weakness to Indians, about how one act of kindness could be seen as an invitation to take advantage. But looking at this injured old man, alone and vulnerable, Garrett couldn't bring himself to ride away. He helped Joseph struggle to his feet, supporting most of the Apache's weight as they made their way to the shade of a large cottonwood. The old man was lighter than expected, his body feeling fragile beneath Garrett's hands. "Water," Joseph whispered once they reached the tree. Garrett retrieved his canteen and watched as the Apache drank slowly, carefully. Up close, he could see the intricate beadwork on the old man's worn leather vest, the careful way his gray hair was braided with small ornaments. This wasn't some savage wanderer. There was dignity here, tradition, a life lived with purpose. "What's your name?" Garrett found himself asking. "Joseph Redhawk," came the quiet reply. "And you are?" "Garrett McKinley. This is my land." Joseph nodded slowly. "Good land, good water. My grandfather hunted here long ago." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. This wasn't just random trespassing. This was something deeper, older than property deeds and territorial surveys. But before he could process what that meant, Joseph Redhawk said something that made his blood run cold. "My son will wonder where I am. He worries when I wander too far." "Your son?" Garrett's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Thomas Redhawk. He leads our people now." "When he cannot find me," Joseph's eyes met Garrett's, and there was no threat in them, only truth. "He will come looking." The name Thomas Redhawk hit Garrett like a punch to the gut. Every rancher within 100 miles knew that name, the Apache leader who commanded respect from both his own people and the territorial government. The man who'd negotiated the last 3 peace treaties and had never broken his word. And Garrett was sitting next to his injured father. "Thomas Redhawk is your son?" Garrett's voice cracked despite his effort to stay calm. Joseph nodded, wincing as he shifted against the tree trunk. "He is a good son. Protective. When the sun begins to set and I have not returned." He gestured weakly toward the eastern horizon. "He will gather the young warriors and ride out searching." Garrett's mind reeled through everything he knew about Thomas Redhawk. The man wasn't just a tribal leader. He was a legend. Stories told of how he'd single-handedly tracked down cattle rustlers who'd stolen from Apache herds, returning them unharmed, but terrified. How he'd negotiated the release of 3 captured settlers without shedding a drop of blood. How he commanded loyalty from warriors who would follow him into hell itself. "How long before he starts looking?" Garrett asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. Joseph studied the position of the sun through the cottonwood leaves. "Soon. Very soon." Panic began to claw at Garrett's chest. Finding an injured Apache elder on his property was bad enough, but having Thomas Redhawk discover his father hurt on a white man's land? That could mean war. Or at the very least, it could mean the end of everything Garrett had worked for. "I need to get you back to your people," Garrett said, standing quickly, "before anyone comes looking." But when Joseph tried to stand, he cried out in pain and collapsed back against the tree. The fall had done more damage than either of them had realized. His face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool shade. "Cannot ride," Joseph gasped. "Ribs, maybe lung." Garrett stared at the injured man in growing desperation. He couldn't move Joseph without risking serious injury, but he couldn't leave him here either. And with every passing minute, the chances of Thomas Redhawk arriving grew stronger. That's when he heard it, the sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Distant but unmistakable. The thunder of multiple horses approaching fast across the hard ground. Too many horses for casual travel, too organized for random riders. Joseph heard it too. His ancient eyes met Garrett's, and in them was something that looked almost like pity. "They come," Joseph whispered. Garrett grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against his saddle, his hands shaking as he checked the chamber. 6 bullets against however many riders were approaching. The math wasn't in his favor, but he'd be damned if he'd go down without a fight. The sound grew louder, closer. Garrett could now distinguish individual hoofbeats, could sense the discipline in their formation. These weren't random searchers. This was a war party moving with deadly purpose, and leading them would be Thomas Redhawk, coming to find his missing father. In the distance, dust clouds began to rise against the afternoon sky. Garrett had maybe 2 minutes before they crested the ridge and saw him standing over their injured elder, with a rifle in his hands. 2 minutes to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. The thunder of hoofbeats grew deafening as 8 Apache warriors crested the ridge, their horses dark silhouettes against the blazing afternoon sky. At their head rode a man who commanded attention even from a distance, Thomas Redhawk, his powerful frame cutting through the air like an arrow in flight. Garrett's finger tightened on his rifle trigger as the war party approached, but Joseph Redhawk's weathered hand suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "No," the old man whispered urgently. "If you point that weapon at my son, there will be no words that can save you." The riders slowed as they approached the creek, their horses snorting and pawing the ground. Thomas Redhawk dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes immediately finding his father beneath the cottonwood tree. What Garrett saw in those eyes made his mouth go dry. Not the wild rage he'd expected, but something far more dangerous. Controlled fury. Thomas was younger than Garrett had imagined, maybe 45, with shoulder-length black hair and scars that spoke of battles won. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with practical riding gear, and a knife hung at his side that looked like it had seen plenty of use. "Father," Thomas said in Apache, his voice carrying across the distance like a blade. Joseph responded in their native language, gesturing weakly toward Garrett. The exchange was brief, but Garrett caught the tone. Explanatory. Calming. Joseph was trying to diffuse the situation. Thomas's dark eyes shifted to Garrett, studying him with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. When he finally spoke, his English was perfect, educated, which somehow made him even more intimidating. "You are on your land," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Garrett replied, hating how his voice sounded small. "This is my property, and my father was trespassing." Again, not a question. Garrett nodded, unsure where this was leading. Thomas stepped closer, and Garrett fought the urge to raise his rifle. The other warriors remained mounted but alert, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Tell me what happened," Thomas commanded. Garrett found himself explaining the encounter, the discovery by the creek, the confrontation, the accidental fall. Throughout his account, Thomas's expression never changed, but Garrett could feel judgment in those steady eyes. "You offered my father water," Thomas noted when Garrett finished. "Well, yes, he was hurt but first, you told him to leave." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Garrett felt heat rise in his cheeks. "He was trespassing. I had a right to." "You had a right," Thomas interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "Just as I have rights." The threat was unmistakable. Garrett glanced at the mounted warriors, counting weapons, calculating odds. If this turned into a fight, he wouldn't last 30 seconds. But then Joseph Redhawk spoke again in Apache, his voice stronger than before. Thomas listened intently, his expression slowly changing. When his father finished speaking, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My father says you helped him when you could have ridden away," Thomas finally said. "He says you brought him water and shade when he was in pain." Garrett wasn't sure if this was good news or if Thomas was simply listing his crimes more thoroughly. "He also says," Thomas continued, "that you were afraid." The words stung because they were true. Garrett had been terrified from the moment he realized who Joseph was, and that fear had only grown with each passing minute. "Wouldn't you be?" Garrett asked, surprised by his own honesty. For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered in Thomas's eyes. "Yes," he admitted, "I would be." The moment stretched between them, two men from different worlds taking each other's measure. Finally, Thomas moved toward his father, kneeling beside the injured elder. "Can you ride?" he asked Joseph in English. Joseph shook his head weakly. "Ribs, maybe broken." Thomas's jaw tightened as he examined his father's injuries. When he looked back at Garrett, his expression had hardened again. "My father cannot be moved safely. He needs rest, medical attention." Thomas stood slowly, his full height imposing. "He will need to remain here until he heals." Garrett's heart sank. Having an injured Apache elder on his property indefinitely was exactly the nightmare scenario he'd been trying to avoid. "For how long?" he asked. Thomas Redhawk's smile was cold as winter wind. "As long as it takes." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas Redhawk's words sank in. Having Joseph recover on his property could take days, maybe weeks. Garrett's mind raced through the implications. Neighbors would talk, territorial authorities might investigate, and his reputation would be destroyed. "Now wait just a minute," Garrett started. but Thomas cut him off with a look that could freeze blood. "My father is injured on your land," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Apache law and white man's law both say you bear responsibility. I didn't hurt him. He fell on his own." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "And yet, here we are." The logic was maddening, but Garrett could see there was no arguing with it. Thomas Redhawk hadn't become a tribal leader by accepting excuses or backing down from difficult positions. "Look," Garrett tried a different approach. "I've got a ranch to run, cattle to tend. I can't have—" "You will have help," Thomas interrupted. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. "Help? 2 of my warriors will remain here to care for my father. They will assist with your cattle." The way Thomas said the word made it clear he considered cattle ranching beneath notice, but he was willing to make practical arrangements. Garrett stared at the mounted Apache warriors, trying to imagine explaining their presence to his neighbors. "People will ask questions. They will think you are honoring a debt," Thomas said firmly. "Which you are." Before Garrett could protest further, Joseph Redhawk spoke from beneath the tree, his voice carrying despite his weakness. He said something in Apache that made Thomas's expression soften slightly. "My father reminds me," Thomas said, turning back to Garrett, "that you could have left him to die, that you brought him water when you had no obligation to do so." He paused, studying Garrett's face. "He believes there is honor in you despite your fear." "I'm not afraid," Garrett lied. Thomas's smile was sharp as a blade. "Yes, you are, and that is wise. Fear keeps men alive when courage fails them." The conversation was interrupted by Joseph calling out weakly. Thomas immediately went to his father's side, kneeling to listen as the old man whispered urgently in Apache. Whatever Joseph was saying made Thomas's face grow dark with concern. When Joseph finished speaking, Thomas remained crouched beside him for a long moment, his hand resting gently on his father's shoulder. The tenderness of the gesture reminded Garrett that beneath the intimidating warrior was simply a son worried about his aging father. "What did he say?" Garrett found himself asking. Thomas stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Joseph's face. "He says the pain is getting worse, that he fears internal bleeding." Thomas's voice carried a new edge of urgency. "My father needs medicine, white man's medicine, or he may not survive the night." Garrett felt the world shift around him. A dying Apache elder on his property would bring consequences he couldn't even imagine. But the nearest doctor was in town, 15 miles away, and Joseph clearly couldn't make the journey. "The doctor won't come out here for an Indian," Garrett said, hating the truth of it. Thomas Redhawk's eyes locked onto his, and in them Garrett saw a challenge that would define everything that came next. "Then you will have to convince him," Thomas said quietly. "Because if my father dies here, on your land under your watch—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, but the threat was crystal clear. Garrett was faced with an impossible choice. Risk everything to save a man he'd wanted gone an hour ago, or watch Joseph Redhawk die and face the wrath of his son. If you were Garrett, what would you do? Risk your reputation and safety to ride into town and demand a racist doctor treat an Apache elder? Or stay and hope Joseph survives without medical help, knowing that failure means facing Thomas Redhawk's justice? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Garrett decided next would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Garrett stared into Thomas Redhawk's unwavering eyes and made a decision that surprised even himself. Without another word, he strode to his horse and swung into the saddle. "I'll get the doctor," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Dr. Morrison will not come willingly. He has strong feelings about my people." "Then I'll have to change his mind." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement of Garrett's resolve. "Take Swift Arrow with you," he said, gesturing to one of his warriors. "If Morrison refuses to come, perhaps seeing one of us will clarify his obligations." The warrior Thomas indicated was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and traditional Apache war paint still visible on his cheekbones. He dismounted smoothly and approached Garrett's horse. "That might make things worse," Garrett said, though he wasn't sure why he was trying to protect a doctor he'd never liked. "Or it might make them honest," Thomas replied. "Swift Arrow speaks English well. He will know if Morrison lies to you." There was no more time to argue. Joseph's breathing had become labored, and a grayish pallor was creeping across his weathered features. Every minute counted now. Garrett and Swift Arrow rode hard toward town, the Apache warrior keeping pace effortlessly, despite riding bareback. The landscape blurred past them as they pushed their horses to the limit, neither man speaking but both understanding the stakes. Town appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent toward evening. Garrett had made this ride countless times, but never with an Apache warrior beside him, and never with a man's life hanging in the balance. They thundered down the main street, drawing stares and whispered conversations from the townspeople. Garrett ignored them all, focusing only on the white clapboard building that served as both Dr. Morrison's office and residence. He dismounted and burst through the doctor's door without knocking, Swift Arrow close behind him. Dr. Morrison looked up from his desk, his face immediately darkening when he saw the Apache warrior. "McKinley, what in God's name?" "I need you to come to my ranch," Garrett interrupted. "There's a man dying." Morrison's eyes flicked to Swift Arrow again. "What kind of man?" "The kind that bleeds red like the rest of us," Garrett snapped. "Are you a doctor or not?" "I don't treat Indians," Morrison said flatly. "You know that." Swift Arrow stepped forward, his presence filling the small office. When he spoke, his English was precise, educated. "The man dying is Joseph Red Hawk, respected elder of our people. His son Thomas Red Hawk leads warriors who have never forgotten an insult." The threat was clear, and Morrison's face went pale. Everyone in the territory knew that Thomas Red Hawk's word was law among the Apache, and his protection extended to all who earned his respect. "You're threatening me," Morrison whispered. "I'm explaining consequences," Swift Arrow replied calmly. Garrett found himself caught between two worlds, two sets of laws that rarely intersected peacefully. But looking at Dr. Morrison's fearful face, he realized that fear might be the only language that worked here. "Doc," Garrett said quietly, "Joseph Red Hawk is dying on my property. If he dies, Thomas Red Hawk will hold me responsible. And if he holds me responsible..." Garrett let his own implications hang in the air. Morrison understood. If anything happened to Garrett, the doctor would be the only witness to this conversation, the only one who could have saved Joseph's life, but chose not to. "I'll need my medical bag," Morrison said finally, his voice resigned. "Already in your buggy," Swift Arrow said with the faintest smile. Morrison stared at the warrior in shock. "How did you—" "We have been watching you since we arrived," Swift Arrow explained. "Thomas Red Hawk does not leave important matters to chance." As they prepared to leave, Garrett realized that everything he thought he knew about this situation had been wrong. This wasn't a random encounter, or a simple trespassing dispute. The Apache had been planning, watching, preparing for multiple outcomes. But the question that gnawed at him as they raced back toward his ranch was simple. If they had been watching Dr. Morrison, what else had they been watching? And what did Thomas Red Hawk really want from all of this? The ride back to Garrett's ranch felt like the longest 15 miles of his life. Dr. Morrison sat rigid in his buggy, clearly terrified but trying to maintain professional dignity. Swift Arrow rode alongside them, his presence a constant reminder of the stakes involved. When they arrived at the creek, the scene had changed dramatically. The Apache warriors had built a small shelter using branches and Garrett's own saddle blankets, creating shade and privacy for their injured elder. Thomas Red Hawk knelt beside his father, speaking softly in Apache while monitoring his breathing. Dr. Morrison approached reluctantly, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. Up close, Joseph's condition was clearly serious. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "I'll need to examine him," Morrison said quietly. Thomas nodded and spoke to his father in Apache. Joseph's eyes opened, focusing on the white doctor with a mixture of resignation and dignity. "He gives permission," Thomas translated. What followed was the most tense medical examination Garrett had ever witnessed. Morrison worked efficiently but carefully, his hands gentle despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. The Apache warriors watched every movement, their faces impassive but their attention absolute. "2 broken ribs," Morrison announced after several minutes. "One has punctured the lung partially. Internal bleeding but not severe enough to be immediately fatal." He looked up at Thomas. "He needs rest, pain medication, and careful monitoring, but he should recover." Relief flooded Thomas's face, the first genuine emotion Garrett had seen from the Apache leader. "How long?" 2 weeks minimum before he can travel safely. "A month would be better." Thomas nodded, then turned to Garrett. "You heard the doctor. My father will remain here during his recovery." Morrison packed his instruments quickly, clearly eager to leave. "I'll need to check on him in 3 days," he said. And if his condition worsens, you will come immediately, Swift Arrow finished. This we understand. After Morrison left, an awkward silence settled over the group. Garrett found himself alone with 8 Apache warriors on his property, responsible for the health and safety of their most respected elder. Your warriors, Garrett began carefully. They can't all stay here. People will. Only 2 will remain, Thomas said. Swift Arrow and Running Bear will tend to my father and assist with your ranch work. The others will return to our people. And you? Thomas's smile was enigmatic. I will come and go as needed. My father's recovery is my responsibility. As the sun began to set, the other warriors prepared to leave. Garrett watched them mount their horses with fluid grace, their departure as organized and disciplined as their arrival had been. Before leaving, Thomas approached Garrett one final time. You surprised me today, he said quietly. How so? You could have let fear control you, could have chosen your comfort over my father's life, but you did what was right, even when it was difficult. Garrett felt heat rise in his cheeks. I just did what anyone would do. No, Thomas said firmly. You did what a man of honor would do. There is a difference. As Thomas mounted his horse to leave with the main group, he called back over his shoulder. Swift Arrow and Running Bear will earn their keep. They are skilled hunters and know cattle better than you might expect. Wait, Garrett called out. How do they know cattle? Thomas's laughter carried across the evening air. Where do you think we learned to raise horses, McKinley? We have been watching your people's methods for decades, learning what works and what fails. The realization hit Garrett like a thunderbolt. The Apache hadn't been raiding cattle. They had been studying ranching techniques. Everything he thought he knew about the relationship between his people and theirs was based on assumptions and prejudices. As the war party disappeared into the gathering darkness, Garrett found himself alone with Swift Arrow, Running Bear, and the injured Joseph Redhawk. The old man was resting comfortably now, the doctor's pain medication helping him sleep peacefully. This is going to be interesting, Garrett muttered to himself. Swift Arrow overheard and smiled. More interesting than you know, McKinley. My grandfather once told me that the best lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. What's that supposed to mean? But Swift Arrow had already turned his attention to building up the fire, leaving Garrett to wonder what other surprises this unlikely partnership would bring. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a troubling question began to form. If the Apache knew so much about cattle ranching, what else did they know about his life that he had never suspected? 3 weeks later, Joseph Redhawk was strong enough to sit up and share meals around the fire that had become the center of an unlikely community. What had started as a forced arrangement had evolved into something none of them had expected, a working partnership that benefited everyone involved. Swift Arrow had proven to be an exceptional tracker, locating 6 head of cattle that had wandered into a canyon Garrett hadn't even known existed on his own property. Running Bear possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather changes, saving the ranch from 2 potentially devastating storms by moving livestock to higher ground just in time. But it was Joseph himself who provided the most surprising revelation. Your grandfather, the old Apache said to Garrett one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. He was a good man. Garrett nearly choked on his coffee. You knew my grandfather? Joseph nodded slowly. During the drought of 1862, when the creek ran dry, he allowed our people to water their horses here, asked for nothing in return, said water belonged to all living things. The words echoed Joseph's first statement when Garrett had found him by the creek, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. This hadn't been random trespassing. It had been a pilgrimage, a return to a place of kindness. My father never told me that story, Garrett said quietly. Your father was young then, frightened by the stories others told about us. But your grandfather, Joseph smiled at the memory. He judged men by their actions, not their blood. Thomas Redhawk chose that moment to emerge from the growing darkness, having arrived for his nightly check on his father's progress. He'd been coming every evening for 3 weeks, and Garrett had begun to look forward to these visits. How are you feeling, Father? Thomas asked in English, a courtesy he'd adopted since learning that Garrett was trying to pick up a few Apache words. Strong enough to ride home, Joseph replied, but not eager to leave such good company. Thomas studied the camp, the shared fire, the easy camaraderie between Swift Arrow and Garrett as they planned tomorrow's cattle drive, Running Bear teaching Garrett how to read cloud formations. What he saw seemed to satisfy him. Perhaps, Thomas said carefully. It is time to discuss the future. Garrett felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this conversation was coming, but he'd been dreading it. The arrangement couldn't last forever, and when it ended, he'd likely return to the isolation and prejudice that had defined his life before. What kind of future? Garrett asked. Thomas sat down across from him, his expression serious. My people have been watching the territorial government's plans for this region. There will be changes coming. Railroad expansion, mining operations, new settlements. Changes that will affect all of us. What does that have to do with me? Survival, Thomas said simply. The old ways of thinking, the old divisions between our peoples, they will not serve us in what is coming. We need allies who understand that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. Swift Arrow looked up from the map he and Garrett had been studying. Thomas is offering you a partnership, McKinley. A real one. What kind of partnership? Garrett asked, though part of him already knew. Your land borders our winter grazing territory, Thomas explained. Your cattle could benefit from access to better grass during the dry months. Our horses could benefit from your breeding knowledge, and both our peoples could benefit from presenting a united front when the railroad men and government officials arrive. It was a generous offer. More generous than Garrett had any right to expect. But he could see the wisdom in it. Isolated ranchers would be easy targets for exploitation, while those with powerful allies would be respected and protected. People in town won't like it, Garrett said honestly. People in town will adapt, Thomas replied with quiet confidence. Or they will find themselves left behind while others prosper. Joseph Redhawk struggled to his feet, his recovery nearly complete. My grandfather used to say that a man's character is revealed not by how he treats his friends, but by how he treats those who are different from him. He looked directly at Garrett. You have shown your character these past weeks. The weight of the moment settled over them all. Garrett realized he was being offered something rare, a chance to be part of something larger than himself, something that could change the future of the territory. If we do this, Garrett said slowly, we do it right. Equal partners, shared decisions, mutual respect. Thomas Redhawk extended his hand, and when Garrett shook it, he felt the strength and calluses of a man who worked as hard as any rancher. Equal partners, Thomas agreed. As they sat around the fire that night, planning their shared future under a canopy of stars, Garrett reflected on how much his life had changed since that afternoon by the creek. He'd started the day as an isolated rancher, suspicious of anyone different from himself. He was ending it as part of a family he'd never expected to find. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of nightbirds calling to each other across the darkness reminded him that the best things in life often came from the most unlikely encounters. Sometimes, what appears to be a simple confrontation between strangers becomes the beginning of something that changes everything. For a cowboy who learned that true strength comes from opening your heart, even when fear tells you to close it. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where courage and compassion collide with destiny in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the American frontier. Click on the video now.